Our second reading comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. Hear now for the word of the Lord. Now after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child, to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. "A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled, because they are no more." When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Holy wisdom, holy word.
Thanks be to God.
So my family, like many families, has some wild stories to tell. I'm sure you all can think of your own wild stories to tell. One story my mother loved to tell us when we were kids was how my great-grandmother Novak, my mom's maiden name, came to Pittsburgh. My great-grandmother was a Polish woman born in the early 1890s in a small village in the then German Empire. Her people had been nationless for over 100 years, and during her short time growing up in this empire, anti-Polish sentiments soared and violence grew. Her family decided to seek better pastures in America and set sail for New York City in 1904. After arriving at Ellis Island, my great-grandmother, her mother, and her father were admitted into the country. One day, when my great-grandmother was about 9 years old, she was walking home when she noticed something great had come to town: a circus. Like any child in the early 1900s, my great-grandmother was expected to work and help the household, but she also was still a child and cherished the sights and sounds of this extravaganza. So her curiosity got the best of her. Instead of going home, she took what little pocket money she had and decided to buy a ticket. She enjoyed the trapeze act and saw her first ever elephant. After the show was done, she began to make her way out of the big top. But in the sway of the crowds, a hand reached out and grabbed her. It pulled her away into the darkness of the surrounding tents, away from the city that she was just getting to know, away from the bright lights, away from her family. From that day on, she would be a hand for this traveling circus. It would be a decade before she would see her family again. Eventually, when my great-grandmother was a young teenager, this traveling circus came to Pittsburgh, and she escaped her captor's grasp into the smog and smoke of the Steel City. Here, she scrounged for money and eventually found her place after meeting my great-grandfather, who was working at a local steel mill. After they saved up some money, she was able to contact her parents and move them to Pittsburgh from New York City. The family was united again, and a new generation was born with my grandfather's oldest brother, Paul, in 1919. I'm sure all of us, even though not quite the same flavor, have family stories that are extraordinary. Ones that are full of narratives, maybe not quite like my own great-grandmother's, but very similar. Ones where oppression was overcome and our people were spared from their abusers. Similar to the Holy Family and their story around Herod. Stories that end in hope. But sometimes stories can seem too good to be true. Too bizarre to be far-fetched. One of my favorite books is called Big Fish. Has anyone read it or seen the movie? Okay, I'm excited. So, there is a movie, so if books aren't quite your thing, go watch the movie. So Big Fish is a story about a man and his father. Edward Bloom is a man who becomes ill and is met by his son, William. Their relationship, like many familial ones, has been strained by years of complexity. Edward is a legendary storyteller who fascinated a young Will with tales of giants, witches, and mermaids who Edward claims to have met in his lifetime. As Will became older, these tales turned sour as he struggled to know his father, as the constant exaggerations felt like a betrayal, like a lie. At Will's wedding, instead of giving a traditional heartfelt speech, Edward recounted a fantastical story of the day Will was born, claiming that he had caught an enormous catfish using his wedding ring as bait. Not quite the story you're looking at for your wedding. So this led to a falling out between Will and Edward. And only 3 years later, when Edward was on his deathbed, did Will and his wife Josephine go to visit him. Even on his deathbed, Edward continued to recount the tales of his life as Will struggled to understand his father. Edward continued with his fantastical tales. Apparently, in his short time on Earth, he not only befriended a giant who was terrorizing his hometown of Ashton, Alabama, but discovered a secret town in the middle of the swamp, joined a traveling circus where the ringmaster ended up being a werewolf, was shot out of a cannon all the way to Auburn, Alabama, and became a Korean war hero by stealing North Korean military documents. And even after that, apparently accidentally robbed a bank when he was a traveling salesman. So after Will hears these stories, he goes to this secret town that his father talked about, the town of Spectre, Alabama, where he meets one of his father's story characters, a woman named Jenny. She tells a slightly different story, that his father ended up coming into some money and loved this town so much and its people that he bought it when it was dying and was in bankruptcy auction. And he, and apparently his circus friends who were real, ended up rebuilding the town. So this is the part of the movie, the part of the book, where Will begins to rethink his father's stories. Now, this town definitely was not lost in a swamp, but it did exist, and Jenny was definitely a real person, and not just a character from Edward's story. When Will returned to see his father, he learned that Edward had had a stroke and was now in the hospital. Edward woke up to Will, but could not speak much, as he was quite weak. He asked Will to narrate how his life ends. Through a shaky voice, Will told his father of their imagined daring escape from the hospital, pushing nurses aside and getting out those front doors and to the river right outside. Once they got to the river, Edward is taken by his son Will into his arms and laid in the river, where he transforms into a giant catfish and swims away. Satisfied with this story, Edward takes his final breaths, knowing his son understands his love for storytelling. At Edward's funeral, Will and Josephine are surprised with all the people from Edward's stories who came to the service. though each one is slightly less fantastical than the way that Edward described them, we'll then begin to understand the truth of the stories that made the mundane fantastical, which explained the deep relationships that Edward formed in his life. The tales of love were true, even though the details weren't quite factual. So I have something to admit to you all. The story that I told you earlier about my great-grandmother may not have been completely true. So yes. Let me clear it out. My grandmother did come to the U.S. from a small Polish village in the German Empire, and she did come through Ellis Island. We have records of that. But at the age of 9, she was not actually kidnapped into a traveling circus and then taken to Pittsburgh. So my great-grandmother also, my great-grandfather did not work in a steel mill. He was a cook at a local restaurant, and my great-grandmother never reunited with her parents in Pittsburgh. So here's the truth. I was told the version of the story that I told you as a child. So that is a story that was well worn. But several years ago, one of my uncles did some digging and found out the details of my great-grandmother's life. My great-grandmother actually did join a traveling circus, but did so when she was 17 out of her own will. Because she wanted to make her own way in the world. And in the early 1900s, a free spirit like hers was not well liked, especially for a woman. So they kind of changed the details of why she was in the circus. And she did leave the circus, but it was only a year later when the circus came to Pittsburgh. And she met my great-grandfather, who was a cook at a local restaurant. And it took them quite a while to have kids, as they scraped by a living, as she was 29 when she had her first child, Paul, which was quite old for the time, and again, was frowned upon. So she would end up having 5 more kids, including my grandfather. And unfortunately, her parents passed away in New York, and they were never reunited. So it's quite a different tale. The story I was told as a child was not fully factual, but the truth of my great-grandparents' lives was evident nonetheless. They were much more complicated than the storybook narrative, and had a not quite as tidy and happy story. But they had a good life. A life full of struggle, yes, but they were hardy and built something here in Pittsburgh. They were hardworking, even though my great-grandfather wasn't the stereotypical steel worker I was told he was. He still worked to build a life as a cook. Even though they did not reunite with my great-grandparents, they still had a loving family, with their children remembering them fondly. The truth of the story is that my great-grandparents were complex human beings who faced adversity and carved out an imperfect but loving family here in Pittsburgh. That is the truth that I hold on to from this story. So I've been going on a while now about several different stories and their truthfulness, factualness, that sort of thing. So you may be wondering, how does this all relate to the gospel passage? Well, I'm about to tell you. Wonder no longer. So the story of the Holy Family escaping from Herod's grasp may be more akin to Big Fish or the story of my great-grandmother. 2,000 years ago, unlike today, the genre of biography didn't exist. Every recounting of a story was told with the expectation that the details may not matter as much as the truth underneath. For example, there are ancient accounts of giant military battles where hundreds of thousands of soldiers were locked into a skirmish. But even the classical Roman Empire at its height only had about 400,000 soldiers spread across the entire empire. So individual battles probably only had tens of thousands instead of hundreds of thousands. But the truth of these battles that the historians recorded was the victories that happened and the things that were lost. This story from the Gospel of Matthew recounts the adversity of God's people as Herod's jealousy is unleashed in a genocide against the youngest of Bethlehem. The Holy Family are spared from this trial when Joseph is warned by an angel to flee to Egypt and eventually return once Herod is dead. Now, the area around Bethlehem has been heavily excavated by modern archaeologists. There is, as of this moment, so things could always change, no evidence of a mass killing of infants in the town from this time period. Contemporary historians such as Josephus didn't mention anything about this supposed mass killing, even though he mentioned much more minor killings with his repulsion to Herod killing his own son. So it seems that this indiscriminate mass murder did not happen. But Josephus does mention something interesting in his notes. During this time, there were many messianic movements that were seeking to usurp Herod. There was a plot during the census which exposed some officials from Bethlehem who were executed for plotting to dispose of Herod. Now, noble families in the Roman Empire were quite large, consisting of tens to hundreds of people. Usually, an entire household was executed, including the servants of the condemned. So in a town of only a couple thousand, this execution of betrayers would have been quite noticeable. But archaeologically, there would be no mass graves, as these nobles would have still been buried properly, despite their betrayal of the king. So it seems there might be some factual evidence that killings did happen in Bethlehem during this time, even though it may not have happened quite like what Matthew recounts. And who's to say that the Holy Family didn't flee to Egypt? So this is speculation here on my part. So any biblical historians, please correct me. But in my imagination, I tend to think that maybe Jesus' family, knowing that they were descendant from royalty, from the line of David, may have had more connections to these officials than the Gospels told us. Even though they didn't have much themselves, who's to say they weren't related to these conspirators and were in danger? So even though I focus greatly on the facts of this story, I think in the grand scheme of things, the facts are less important than the truth of this story. When we look at the fleeing of the Holy Family to Egypt, we see our Lord as a refugee of political violence. God being with those who are experiencing pain and death, who have had to leave their home because it is no longer safe. The truth of this passage is that God is with the abused, with the refugee, with those who fear for their safety. God is with us, all of us. The word Emmanuel, that we sing so much during this time, means God with us. God, through Christ, has experienced our humanity, experienced the pain of loss, the fear of insecurity, the hurt of betrayal, the messiness of this world. But the good news is that these things, pain, loss, hurt, do not have to define us. They do not define God. As joy, hope, peace, and most importantly, love came to us through Jesus Christ, the sin of the world, the messiness of this world, does not have the last say, as Christ's work did not end at the cross. That tomb is empty. Love won. And now we have a risen Lord who still advocates for us, who still feels for the refugee, seeks justice for the abused, and extends an open hand to all to experience a new life rooted in love, peace, and justice for every one of us. The truth of the gospel, the truth of all stories, is not always found in the chronological facts of a narrative, but in the heart and soul of the people who are telling it. It's found in the hope of a new beginning and the love of relationships that are made in this life. Whether it is the story of a big fish, a great-grandmother, or the Savior of the world, the truth is this: in the complexity of this life, joy, hope, and love burst through into a world that experiences pain, loss, and suffering. This is what Christmas is all about. During this liturgical season after the holiday, we continue to dwell in this celebration that love has come for us. Peace has come into this world through an innocent child. Hope has come for us through the loving actions of Jesus Christ. And joy has broken through the messiness of this world as we look forward to a future where nothing, neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.